on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, Bill, Omari. You've gotten a lot of information out there, thrown out some interesting points for discussion. Makes my job a little bit easier. And I took the theme of this conference seriously about looking toward the future of Thomas Sankara's legacy after the November elections. But, to look to the future, we have to look to the past. The two are inextricably linked. Last week brought a dramatic reminder of that when prosecutors for Burkina Faso's military court system announced that they had brought charges of murder against General Gilbert Diendéré in Sankara's assassination many years ago now. He and other officers of the former Presidential Guard, because that has now been dissolved, were already in custody facing legal accusations because of their failed coup attempt in September. And about 10 lower-ranking soldiers had also been charged specifically in Sankara's assassination. They finally got around to Diendéré. Actually, it turns out the charges were laid on November 12th, but they kept them secret till after the elections. They probably didn't want to influence the polling process. But that's a big development. It became even bigger a few days later. We're talking just last week, when the military courts revealed that they had also brought charges against 3 former soldiers of the Presidential Guard again in the 1998 assassination of independent newspaper editor Norbert Zongo. As the cases unfold over the coming months, now this is the military court system. I don't know how much of that's going to be public. There will be press conferences periodically to inform the public about what's happening. But we'll probably learn a lot more about how Compaoré came to power and how he governed in the 27 years he was in office. On the Sankara case specifically, some of the media commentators in the Burkinabe media have been hoping certain questions will get answered. What was Diendéré's precise role in the Sankara killing? He's already admitted it was his people who did it. He claims that, they were just going to arrest him and things got out of hand. Who gave the order? Who did the shooting? We have some ideas, but, things have to be proved in a court. What foreigners or foreign powers were implicated in the coup attempt? In the coup, it wasn't an attempt, it succeeded. Now, the new director of the military court system, a Colonel Sita Sangare, said that Compaoré himself is not now being pursued in the case. But, he added, if the evidence points in that direction, he would not exclude that possibility. Now, some of the questions, same ones, could be answered in terms of the Zongo case. The killers were from the Presidential Guard. What role, again, did Diendéré have in that? Did Compaoré's brother, Francois, have a role? Because the Zongo was investigating the murder of Francois' driver by members of the Presidential Guard. Whether and how such questions get answered won't shed light only on the past. The answers can influence political life in the here and now and in the near future. A resolution of these cases, or even just having the trials themselves, will put a lot more pressure on the many other cases of political persecution, torture, killings, and corruption that happened under the under the Compaoré regime. And quite a few foreign ministers are in prison at the moment awaiting charges on corruption and so on. So this will be an interesting time. Now, on a personal note, back in May and June, they had exhumed Sankara's body from the shallow grave in Ouagadougou. I was reading through the reports, and it just brought me back to the time, just a couple of days after the coup in 1987, when I too was at the gravesite with hundreds and hundreds of Burkinabe who came out. They knew he was there. There wasn't any markers, just a mound on the ground, to mourn their president. It was a very emotional time. So I'm reading through the reports how shallow the grave was. They found bits of clothing, a sneaker, things like that. But being there just a couple of days after the coup, just this enormous outpouring of grief, it's obvious that Sankara meant a lot to a lot of people. I saw that too when he was still alive and the reactions of the population to him. But at that time, with his death, I didn't know back then how long the memory of Sankara would last. So it's been very gratifying to see how durable his legacy has been, and a testament to Sankara's place in the history of Burkina Faso, in the history of Africa, and the history of the world. Now, following the coup, I continued to follow developments in Burkina Faso, various political developments. I was angry at the Compaoré regime, wanted to figure out how it functioned, but I also paid close attention to the expression of his legacy over time. And it only took a few years till the first ones emerged, because initially it was a taboo subject. You could get arrested, tortured for being pro-Sankara, but very quickly they had to backtrack, given the depth of his popularity. And then you saw the emergence of political parties that called themselves Sankarist. Especially important youth movements. Didn't run elections, but they were active youth movements who upheld Sankara's ideas and actions. And traveling around Africa, it was also gratifying every now and then to run into activists from other countries. Oh, wow, you know Sankara, tell us about him. We loved Sankara. Somebody I worked with at the UN just a few years ago, he's from Cameroon. And he remembered when he was in high school and Sankara was killed, and they had protests. Now, around the time of the 25th anniversary of his death, I wrote an essay for a British academic journal on the legacies of Thomas Sankara, trying to analyze how it was that a quarter of a century later, he was still having such an impact. People were still seeing the ideas and practices from that era as so relevant. That essay grew into the book, Thomas Sankara, an African Revolutionary. The publisher approached me to write it, and I said, yeah, sure, why not? That would be great. So I gave, most of it's about his formation, the ideas and events that shaped him as a person, how the revolution came about, and the policies. Most of the book is about the policies and practices under the revolutionary period. Just on Bill's comments, I think Sankara would probably agree with most of what Bill said, in principle. He knew his Lenin. He read him carefully. He had Lenin's works in his office. He had a bust of Lenin on his desk. The particular problem in Burkina was the raw material to work with. The political groups, the small, tiny groupuscule that existed in the country, and they were the ones pushing for amalgamating and forming a party, and he saw that, given their political outlook in general, which was very repressive, and I'll say a word that it doesn't get said a lot, Stalinist. They were open about it. You go into the Palais de Justice in Ouagadougou, there's a big poster of Stalin on the wall. It's kind of startling. But, that was one of these people's heroes. So, he wanted to put the brakes on that a bit and said, wait a minute, let's have a broader discussion. Let's find a more open framework where ordinary people can be brought in, or activists in the CDRs, at least, can find some other political framework to be organized. So the second to last chapter is called The Last Battles. I go through some of that in there, where his differences with the other currents. And, it's those currents who were hostile to Sankara's openness, his attempts to bring in other parts of the population, to have political debate. They formed the core of Compaoré's party after he carried out the coup. They gave it a Marxist name even, and that became later the CDP, the ruling party. Compaoré was one of those they won over. He was actually with the pro-Sankara group, but then after the coup, he found a way to survive. But some of the others were part of that group. Anyway, the last chapter is on the legacies of Sankara. And I end it with, and I'll quote from that, from Demba Musa Dembele, who's an activist scholar from Senegal. And he said, above all, Sankara's ongoing popularity is due to the ideas and values he embodied. If Sankara arouses as much fervor today as he did more than 2 decades ago, this was written a few years ago, it is because he embodied and defended causes that resonate today among the world's oppressed. Now, that was written before the movement to overthrow Campore. In fact, by coincidence, the official release date for the book was November 1st, 2014, the day after Campore fled. If I'd waited a little bit longer, I could have had more about the popular movement against Campore, but it would have been the same story. Well, I'm working on a different book. Well, it does get into the anti-Campore movement. In looking at that protest movement, I mean, you all know this, there's no escaping Sankara's prevalent influence. Many of the activists were open supporters of Sankara. You see the videos and photos of the demonstration. They're carrying portraits. They're chanting slogans, La patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons. Even those politicians you might call bourgeois would put them in their speeches. They'd wear faso d'Anfani, that was popularized under Sankara, the outfit, the homespun cotton outfit. Balai Citoyen was formed in 2013 by the rapper Smucky and the reggae man Sams Keleja. And Sankara is their open hero. I mean, he's the person they point to. After Sankare's overthrow, Campore's overthrow, I got to be careful not to slip back and forth too easily. They formed a transitional government. It was an ad hoc, hodgepodge kind of thing. But they brought in, as their Minister of Justice, Josephine Ouedraogo, who was a member of the government under Sankara, and then later went abroad to work under most of Campore's reign. The head of the transitional parliament was Sharif C., who was openly a Sankarist. He was the organizer of the 20th anniversary celebrations in Burkina Faso. At public rallies, even President Michel Kafando, politically somewhat conservative, a former diplomat, and Prime Minister Lieutenant Colonel Zida would occasionally talk about positive aspects of Sankara's revolution. I mean, they weren't Sankarists, but it played well. You know, your big rally, Zida got rid of his military uniform, put on Faso d'Anfani, and would be pumping his fist and chanting slogans. They do it because it played well. And as Omari mentioned, during the coup attempt in September, who was it who went out there and stopped the coup makers? Balai Citoyen was in the front lines. Sharif C., who was the highest-ranking member of the transitional government, not in detention. He openly raised a call for resistance from hiding over rebel radio. And other activists across the country who basically blocked the military coup and put pressure on lower-level commanders at the captain level, not the generals, they were sitting on the fence, but put pressure on the lower-level commanders who started mobilizing their units to march on Ouagadougou. The coup makers never had any base outside of Ouagadougou. It was limited, so they lasted a week. Now, of course, in the elections we just had, you, of course, had the candidacy of Benawende Sankara. No, not part of the Sankara family, but there's other Sankaras out there, quite a few. There are other Campores, there are other many Ouedraogos, Sawadogos. So you can't make an assumption by the last name. Anyway, he was backed by an alliance of 9 parties. To me, though, what was more interesting was some of the other presidential candidates and how they had to play there or position themselves. Jean-Baptiste Natama, who sometimes presented himself as a Sankarist candidate. I knew him from '85. He was a local CDR activist back then. Saran Serame was one of the, I think there were just 2 women presidential candidates. But anyway, she would point out that her first political action was in 1987 when she came out to protest Sankara's assassination. And then Zefran Diabre, who had been a minister in Compaore's government, broke with Compaore relatively early, got a job at the UN, worked for the French nuclear power company Areva, many links to business, and calls himself a liberal in terms of liberal in the European sense of free markets. His last rally in Ouagadougou, he said that if he is elected, he will carry out Sankara's economic program. Now, this is a guy whose thinking is far from those of Sankara, but he thought this would get him some votes. Now, looking at the developments of the past year, it seems to me that Sankarism, if you can use that term, I kind of doubt Sankara himself would have, but it's much more about championing to the day-to-day struggles of ordinary people than seeking elective office. I look carefully at the vote totals of the Sankarist candidates and parties. Benewende got some 86,000 votes for president in total out of more than 3 million. That was 2.7%. His party, the UNER PS, did a little bit better. It got 120,000 votes, enough to get 5 deputies elected to the legislature, one more than they had before. You could add in perhaps the votes of 2 smaller Sankarist parties. That would add another 20,000. So you break 140,000 votes. Now, if I recall correctly, that total isn't all that different from what the Sankarist candidates got in the last elections under Compaore. So you have to ask questions. Now, the Sankarist party's poor showing or disappointing showing does not mean that Sankara's ideas aren't popular. They are. Even though the elections were freer than any other previously, the game remained stacked. Those candidates and parties with access to money, basically the old business sectors, links to the traditional chieftaincy, they're the ones who were able to mobilize the votes. They could get their ideas out. Other parties, the more radical ones, just simply lacked the resources to go around and campaign, to get their ideas out. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't money talk in our elections here in this country and most other countries? So just to summarize, the strength of Sankara's legacy, to me, seems to be expressed more clearly in the streets than in the ballot box. Now, some of the activists in Burkina, inspired by Sankara, have drawn implications from this. Balai Citoyen, for instance, avoids party politics. They focus much more on activist struggles, against power blackouts, local things like that. I don't mean to imply that activism and electoral engagement are contradictory. They're not. But in whatever arena one operates, it seems most crucial to remain rooted in the struggles of ordinary people. That brings me to my final broad point. Sankara's legacy had many different sides. The revolution he led was not just about one thing. It was about transforming society as a whole in ways that would especially benefit those at the bottom. His legacy can be used by people in many different ways. They can pick and choose, depending on the occasion, to fight against corruption, to oppose foreign domination, to advance women's rights, to counter repressive and arbitrary rule, to improve prospects for poor farmers, to build more constructive economies, and so on. That helps also account for why Sankara is popular outside Burkina Faso. He's not just a son of Burkina Faso. Those ideas resonate everywhere. And across the African continent and beyond, it's not unusual to have opposition-minded youth citing his name and ideas. Some of the leaders of Yenamar, the radical youth movement in Senegal, often wear Sankara t-shirts at their protests and meetings. It's not to be provocative, but it's just to signal what political perspective they embrace. Earlier this year, Balai Citoyen hooked up with Yenamar. They went to Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, in solidarity with Congolese activists who were opposing Kabila's efforts to perpetuate his rule and power. Now, looking across the continent, I think you could fair to say that Sankara certainly is better known in those parts of Africa that use French, former French, Belgian colonies, so on, for communicating with each other. I mean, his interviews and speeches, you just Google, you go online, you find video clips, you find the text of his speeches easily in French. But his ideas also travel well in the English-speaking world when they're available. That's why the Sankara Speaks book by Pathfinder Press is so important. It includes many of his most important speeches and interviews. I'm glad to have been able to contribute a little bit to helping get out the story of Sankara and his revolution in my short biography. Now, Ohio University Press published it here in the US and through its distribution networks in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. In Southern Africa, the book has been co-published by South Africa's Jacana Press. And there's interest in Sankara in South Africa, evidently. Back in May, the exclusive books, which is kind of like the Barnes & Noble of South Africa, they have a chain of bookstores throughout the country, they released a list of their most stolen books. This was number 4 from the top. Now, since those stealing the books probably can't afford to buy it, although it's not very expensive, but still they can't afford it, I'm assuming it's getting into the right hands. 2 months later, an article appeared in the Rand Daily Mail, South African newspaper, by a professor, Yasna Jagarnath, with the title, Sankara's Stance on Sovereignty Still Resonates Today. It begins by talking about the Greek economic crisis and, Sankara's views on the foreign debt and how relevant that is. And then he goes on, I think he got my book, because there's quotations that I have, they're my own translations from the French he used. So, he has a bit about the record of the revolution. And I just want to conclude by quoting the way he ended his article. Around the world, young people often find themselves coming of age in a moment when politics seems to be more about grubby personal interest than any attempt to reorganize society in the interests of justice. Strong figures who are incorruptible and driven by a resolute commitment to justice are often attractive. It's no surprise that in South Africa, as in much of the continent, Sankara is rapidly taking his place in the pantheon of heroes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ernest. Let's give us another round of applause to all the speakers for their insights, contributions, and powerful contribution. Woman, and she's an activist, and she believes in justice and freedom, and she works with the Embassy of Venezuela. Flavia Marquez. So she's a diplomat, and here in DC, the Embassy of Venezuela has been doing some wonderful work, and they contribute to our education. If Thomas Sankara has created the political party you were talking about, or the organization you were mentioning, and that they still killed him, so how will you see the future of the political institution you were talking about? Don't you think that those who wanted to assassinate him will have done everything possible to destroy that political institution? These are the 2 questions for you.
There had to be a mass base. But that means that you have to then create a process, some sort of process that's moving in that direction. And the over-reliance on an individual becomes a problem. There are obviously political parties and movements where they've lost their top leaders, but they've been able to keep going. The Sandinistas, for example, lost Carlos Fonseca, and were able to keep moving. And that also was a real tribute to the way that the Sandinistas were organized. Then you can have a situation where there's massive repression. I mentioned Indonesia. where in 1965, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million and 3 million people were killed, right? So where the government, the right wing, decided to just wholesale eliminate the opposition. So it's impossible for me to say that if they had just taken out Sankara, but there had been a party, what might have happened. But what we do know is that in the absence of organization, people are left in a dilemma. Think in the United States. Malcolm X was unable to create a sustaining organization. When he was killed, the organization that he had built, or the two organizations, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization for Afro-American Unity, were simply unable to continue. Right? There had been insufficient time and effort put into the organization building. There was so much based around Malcolm as the great leader. And this is not a criticism of Malcolm. I'm saying that he basically ran out of time. But you also have to, in building movements, you have to figure out how to put that time aside to develop organization. And despite every challenge that you're up against, and building organization and building successor leaders is one of these things that we frequently in movements put off to the side. We think that we have more time to do it, and then we don't.
Okay, question to be.
I'm sorry, say it again.
It does not point to the general difficulty or challenge of having a revolution or successful revolution in the peasant society in general, and most particularly in Africa, because Burkina Faso is one of the poorest country, even in the context of West Africa.
Yeah.
Before there is somebody from the audience wants something.
So you're going to go a little bit late. Then you might want to ask you questions.
So the big pleasure again.
All right, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution, Bill Fletcher. I think that this is a great year. You talked about the possibility of Sankara to organize something just to carry on the revolution, even if he were killed. But you just forget to mention that the one who killed Sankara is one of those who built the revolution. Blaise Compaoré is among those who have the main ideas about the revolution. That's first. And second, Sankara started by just setting the Committee of the Defense of the Revolution. And we saw that after the killing of Sankara, not only Sankara were killed, but all those people who were gravitating around him, they kept on killing him for years and years again. So they kept claiming all those possible people who could just bring the revolution back again. So this is a point that you should not forget in all those things. And those were those I wanted to just thank you very much.
Not the peasant society question, but the weakness of the existing state and the very limited educated elites that one has to work with. You had the starting within the CDRs of getting activists who didn't know how to speak French to start organizing and functioning, but to have a discussion at the national level, you at least had to have some. We did have a group, the New Jewel Movement, that was organized, and from within they had a coup. They killed Morris Bishop.
That's right.
But with killing Bishop, it wasn't necessarily that they didn't have an organization. They destroyed the organization they had by destroying the link between the leadership and the masses and the population, who didn't have any confidence in Bernard Cord. I mean, how could you? Same as people didn't have any confidence in Blaise Compaoré. I mean, they were similar personalities, sort of bureaucrats, Stalinist bureaucrats. So that link between leadership and masses, in addition to organization, is vital. I think you need them both.
Okay.
That's just my take.
Okay, thank you. Omari, you want to say something about the same topic?
Yeah.
Okay, Bill, after Omari, I have another question about the same question. Yeah, Omari.
Yeah, I was going to raise the question of Grenada as well. because there's so many similarities. There are similarities in terms of the political perspective of both Campari and those around him, and Bernard Cord and others around them. A third of the population of Grenada went into the streets to free Maurice Bishop and the other leaders of the Grenadian Revolution. A third of the population. 30,000 out of 100,000 people. Small act. This question goes to the question of the link between the real leadership and the pretending leadership. I would submit, I had an opportunity to meet the murderers of Maurice Bishop before the end of the revolution. They destroyed the revolution. The revolution, and Fidel Castro makes a very important point. Revolutions can only be destroyed from inside, not outside. The revolutionary, I mean, think about that now. You've got a little country of 4 or 5 million people up against the mightiest military power in the world, and it still exists. And still is an example. Cuba, I'm talking about Cuba. That leadership is still there, no matter how old Fidel Castro is and Raul Castro. The continuity of revolutionary leadership in Cuba is still there. This is what was broken in Burkina Faso, and this is what was broken in Grenada by the same type of political leadership. Ernest doesn't like to use the expression, but these are, if you remember, those who really study it know that the reason why Sankara, I think Bill hit it too, didn't want to put together a so-called vanguard party is because there was no agreement between many of the major leaders. Campore didn't agree, Zongo didn't agree, and it went down the list with what the political perspective that Sankara laid out. And the proof of the pudding was, what did they do after they got rid of Sankara? They dismantled the whole revolution. And Campari had at the end of his regime, had the honor of being a handmaiden with U.S. and French imperialism in the fight in Mali and the negotiations between the different groups in West Africa. He was an ally of the French and the United States. The United States dumped a lot of money on him to do that. But the small number of workers who existed in Burkina Faso at the time. Okay. But that was part of what I think was the problem.
Okay, Bill, before you want to leave or before you leave?
Before he leaves, go ahead.
Bill, before the fact that a leader might not have built the right institution, it poses the question of the nature of some exceptional leaders in the community too. Now, because maybe Malcolm messed the movement, and after he was killed, Rafa Benati, who thought that king was Moses, that he was Joshua, and could not take the people to the promised land. Mm-hmm. So I think that for me, sometimes it's not just about the mistakes or the weaknesses of the leaders, but sometimes there are some people who are exceptional leaders. Maduro is a great president, but he cannot be Chavez.
No, I think that that's absolutely correct, that there are exceptional leaders. When I first started thinking about this question, really thinking about it, was when Harold Washington died in Chicago, the mayor of Chicago. Harold Washington was brought forward by masses of people in Chicago who said, we want you to run for mayor. It wasn't the other way around. It was people that went to him, said, we want you to run. And this phenomenal movement was built that in many ways transformed Chicago. But there was an absence of thinking about, well, like, what happens if he's no longer with us? And when he dropped dead, the movement unraveled. I mean, it unraveled almost overnight. And it was just phenomenal to watch it from afar. In organizations and in revolutions, there is always the tendency to confront the immediate challenge and to put off for later the question of successorship and the question of organizational transitions.
Institutional.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's always that tendency. Because it's like that saying, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember you're there to drain the swamp, right? In every movement, we're up to our ass in alligators. There's not one moment when the enemy says, okay, you guys can rest for a while,
No.
right? So we're always confronted with that. But the problem is, if we don't build in the time to create organization, to build the transition, etc., then we overly rely on charismatic leaders. And we overly rely on, in effect, magical thinking, i.e. that this person is going to be there forever. And when they are not, we end up often becoming disoriented. That's all my point. So it's not like in any way that I'm trashing Sankara any more than I'm trashing Harold Washington. I'm saying, however, that we have enough experience now that we should understand that we have to constantly be building organization, constantly paying attention to transition, and particularly generational transitions. We have to constantly be thinking about that someone who may be a great leader is not going to be with us forever. And even if they are with us for a long time, their ideas often get stale. So we have to be bringing forward new people. And that's where reflective, self-critical, learning organizations that have humility become essential. And that means breaking with a lot of the vanguardism that was so dominant in the 20th century. I got to run, otherwise my lead.
Whether to black people in this land, because you mentioned about the Grenada, you mentioned about what happened in Cuba, what happened in who killed Lumumba, who killed Amilcar Cabral, what is the revolution of Africa, why we are failing. Organization is very important. Kwame Ture, Carmichael, says we need all the time, he says, let's be organized. Organization, the continuity will be firm. On top of that, we Africans, we kill, the media will show how Lumumba was killed. They were putting things, how our brothers were torturing him. But who did that? Why are we not able to be loyal to ourselves? Why little money that will just fly away will be replaced by our sincere brothers and sisters who struggle for our right, for our freedom? That is our problem. We have to really go up beyond who killed Sankara. We don't know. It is from the outsiders, the French, the Americans, the Europeans, who do not want us to be love each other. They want for Africa 3 things: war, fighting each other, famine, and
You can say that in a marriage.
health. What do you call?
Sickness like HIV, Ebola,
everything. It can come outside, but they want us to be Africans with a negative, the English is killing me. The French, the English is, we do not have mutual communication language that would have been solved our problem. In any case, let us be strong enough, organized, so that there will be a continuity of struggle to wear our freedom.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I would like to thank those who organized this conference. Really, thank you very much. My question is maybe directed to Professor Ernest. So I really appreciate his point about the fact that Sankara's legacy is much more expressed in the street rather than in ballads. So don't you think that this is due to the fact that the Sankaris or the so-called Sankaris are not so united as we would think? And also, maybe can we link this aspect to, the lack of unity among the Sankaris to this whole idea of organization the great lady has just talked about?
Okay. Now,
thank you.
Okay, before it's going to be very welcome for us to pay some of the bills, Anyway, so James Harris.
World is to build a revolutionary party. The thing about Sankara, the thing about Malcolm X, the thing about Maurice Bishop, there's a tendency to separate them out and make them icons up above the political process that created them. That is true. But they were practical political people who were trying to form organizations to lead their revolutions forward. They have a political record that you can read and understand and begin to carry out. One of the big problems that we confront is that we tend to be content with just making them icons. They weren't. They were the ones that argued against it. They were the ones that tried to organize the masses into political activity. You can look at them and then say what they should have done, but they were doing what they should have done. Sankara was presented with a problem. Do I act or do I discuss acting? So I act and try to form the political party that is necessary to do that. How do I do that? The only way to begin to do that is to act. But his words are in print. What he thought is in print. He's not above politics. Read him. Take him seriously. We'd take Malcolm X more seriously if we actually did that. We'd take Tom. These were actual political people who engaged in politics and tried to gather those forces around them that could sustain the revolution. Don't think they were so naive as to think that they were going to live forever. These are the foremost materialists in the world that exist. We're not superior to them on that. We have to learn from them, but actually study them. Don't put our projections up on them. Study them. Study what Sankara actually said. And as Ernest said, he confronted the problem of trying to set up and he didn't say he wasn't trying to do it, but he confronted what? What do we have to do? Set up a Stalinist party? So he's trying to figure that out in the process of doing that, but he acted. That was the major thing. Anyway, read it.
Okay. Thank you very much, James.
By Sankara, and I am obviously one of millions. So what I see in Sankara is somebody, a young person, a relatively young person who is trying to make a revolution, and there is a lot of limitations, and he's working with a population that is 98% illiterate, and he doesn't have much time, and there's all sorts of political forces against him. And he's doing as much as he can do. And I think, if we look at it objectively, there were, maybe he could have developed people more, or what, but I think he was trying to do that. That's my sense. I don't think that he was relishing in the cult of personality. I think he was just a very dynamic person. And so, I think that the many people who are looking at him are inspired because they see that people will organize and do amazing things, and you know, against all odds. And I guess I'm seeing the positive, the potential of a real revolution if, again, there was more time. And I believe that, you know, that scenario is possible. So I think, you know, the criticism of him and that scenario is maybe too much. So thank you for your comment.
Good, thank you. Ernest?
Just a couple comments. I mean, it's hard to compare the revolutionary era under Sankara with the situation in Burkina Faso over the past year or so. The context within which these groups that call themselves Sankarists function is quite different. It's not a revolutionary situation. They had a popular uprising insurrection that overthrew Compaoré. That was not really a revolution. You ended up with a transitional government that was kind of an ad hoc coalition of the military, the old political leaders of the various political parties, and the civil society activists. The most surprising thing about it was the strength of the activists in that period, which is very, very rare in Africa. They were members of parliament. They pushed through legislation. They tried to root out as best they could the remnants of the Compaoré system. They barred a whole bunch of Compaoré's people from running in the election. With the help of the anti-coup resistance, they managed to get rid of the presidential guard. They were able to do quite a lot. I agree. Yes, the problem of disunity among the Sankarist groups is real. They talk about it. I'm going there in about 6 or 7 weeks, and I'll spend about a month, and I'm going to talk to some of these people and see what they think, where their weaknesses were. But I don't think there are simple solutions. Relating it to the organizational question, what are you doing during a revolution, I think it doesn't quite fit because it was a different situation. They don't present themselves as revolutionary parties. They uphold the revolutionary ideas of Sankara. But Benawende Sankara says his party is social democratic. Kaboré's party says it is social democratic. What does that mean? You know, I don't think Balai Citoyen does that, but I'm going to try to tease out some of those differences. But you can see in terms of what was actually accomplished, it was the activists on the ground who seem to have done the best job of it. And they're in a good position right now. You know, they're going to maintain an oppositional stance to whatever government is there. They're going to say, these are the important issues, and we're going to press on it. You've promised more democracy. You've promised justice for the killers. We're going to hold you to that account, and they're going to put pressure on from outside. Unfortunately, the Sankarist parties, they're sort of part of the political game. It's not a denigration. They may have to do that to function. But they're going to have one foot inside and one foot outside. The strength of the Sankarist parties, I mean, Benawende Sankara was out there in the streets with the activists during the insurrection in October 2014. Kaboré was not. You know, they had their meetings with Zephyrin Diabre and the others, but they weren't with the activists in the street. The Sankarist parties know that that's where they need to be, and they have a foot in that world. And as long as they need to keep that foot there solidly on the ground, I think, to have any real effect down the line.
Good, thank you. Okay.
Right now, my opinion is that this is the biggest political opening that they've had. I don't mean the Sankarists. I mean the masses of people, the politically conscious people who want to move on implementing the ideas that Sankara tried to implement. That's what I think is happening now. And we'll see whether or not these other groups that are out there try to close down the political space that these masses have won. You can have big meetings there, big discussions. We need more discussion in Burkina Faso to discuss in action. A revolution is action. The brother made the point that Sankara had to decide. Do I think about and discuss, or do I act? And a revolution is acting. So you make a mistake, big deal. Everybody makes mistakes. But the real problem is, are you trying to lead the masses forward to make a revolution, to do what he said he was trying to do? He didn't just say French imperialism is bad. He went all over the world explaining why it was to everybody who would listen, and so on. He came here to talk to us, meaning African Americans in the United States. You remember that? No, many people in the room don't remember, but he came here, and he expressed anyway, that's another story. That was one of the first things that you do. He spoke to the African American population about making revolution. He was like Malcolm. He was like Maurice Bishop, understanding the crucial role that African American workers, young people, play in the struggle around the world. Around the world, not just here, around the world. There will be solidarity with the next rise of the revolutionary struggle in Burkina Faso here in the United States. It won't be a lot of discussing back and forth and so on. Maybe there'll be that. There'll be big meetings. There'll be demonstrations in front of the White House to demand the United States gets its nasty hands off the people in Burkina Faso. You know they're going to have their hands on it. But a revolution is action. Thinking through in action. That's what I think Sankara represents. Just one little thing. This thing about icons sort of drives you crazy. I remember that they had a postage stamp in the United States, a regular stamp, with Malcolm X. That's how far they took it off pretty soon, but they had it. That's how far they're willing to go. And we never thought of Malcolm X as an icon. We thought of Malcolm X as our political leader, the most advanced political leader produced in the 20th century in the United States, coming out of the black liberation struggle. That's what produced Malcolm. He didn't produce it. That's the same thing with Sankara. Wasn't he a product of the society and the struggles of the masses of Burkina Faso? Not the other way around. And every revolutionary leader is that way. That's what we have to strive for. We have to act in that manner and not poo-poo it or is above us. How was he above us? Here it is. You can read what he says. You can read what he says. Not a lot of editorial comment here. This is Sankara's speeches. I urge all of you to read it. Study it very closely. Not that we're going to repeat every single thing he did. We won't do that. As Ernest explained, the situation today, here and there, is different than it was in 1983. But the tasks I tried to outline at the end of my remarks are the same. To build a revolutionary leadership in action that begins to conquer the political ground that leads us to actually taking power. Isn't that what Sankara was about? He says it. I read it. He says the object of the revolution is to put the power in the hands of the people. We have the same task here in the United States. It's not just Burkina Faso.
Thank you very much.